Some creatures don't choose where they belong, her grandmother used to whisper. Sometimes they choose who feels safe. The first wolf pup nearly knocked Evelyn Carter off her feet. 1 second, she was stumbling through knee-deep snow behind the Moon Hunt Festival, her fingers stiff from cold, the bitter sting of humiliation still lodged in her chest. The next, something warm and trembling crashed into her coat. She gasped, boots slipping against frozen dirt as tiny claws caught the fabric near her ribs. A soft whine rose against her heart. For one stunned second, Evelyn thought she had imagined it. The wind screamed through the pines. Snow hissed across the dark woods. Somewhere behind her, distant laughter spilled from the glowing festival hall where warmth, music, and roasted meat waited for everyone except her. "You smell like weakness." The word still echoed in her mind, sharp as winter ice. She had only stepped near the bonfire for warmth. Just for a moment. But Beta Matthew had wrinkled his nose like she carried something rotten. Then others laughed. Someone muttered that even stray dogs had more use than a rejected Omega, who couldn't even hold a proper bond. Evelyn had smiled anyway. Quietly. The way she always did when humiliation pressed too hard against her ribs. Then she left before anyone could see the tears in her eyes. But now this. She looked down slowly. Nestled against her chest was the smallest wolf pup she had ever seen. White fur streaked silver beneath layers of dirt and melting snow. Tiny paws trembled violently. One ear bent awkwardly, damp with frost. It couldn't have been more than a few months old. "Oh my God," Evelyn whispered. The pup shoved its nose harder beneath her coat, pressing against her sweater like it had finally found warmth after hours of fear. Its heartbeat fluttered wildly against her ribs, frantic and exhausted all at once. Something inside her chest cracked open. Lonely recognized lonely. Without thinking, she shrugged off her scarf and wrapped it around the tiny thing. "Hey," she whispered softly, crouching despite the freezing wind biting through her jeans. "You're okay now." The pup looked up. Its eyes stopped. Her breath. Silver. Not gray. Not blue. Silver like moonlight reflecting off frozen water. Strange. Beautiful. Familiar somehow. Then another sound came. Smaller. Weaker. A trembling cry carried through the trees. Evelyn froze. Slowly she turned toward the dark woods. 20 feet away, barely visible beneath a fallen branch dusted in snow, something moved. Her stomach dropped. Another pup, smaller than the first, curled tightly into itself, shivering so hard its tiny body barely moved. Snow clung to its pale fur. One little paw twitched weakly. "No, no," Evelyn breathed, already moving. Her boots crunched through ice as she dropped to her knees beside it. The second pup opened sleepy silver eyes before letting out the faintest sound, a soft, broken whimper that somehow hurt worse than crying. "You poor baby," Evelyn whispered, voice shaking. The first pup immediately climbed higher against her chest, as if urging her closer. Like it already knew. Like it trusted her. Evelyn slipped trembling hands beneath the smaller pup, gathering it carefully into her arms. It weighed almost nothing. Too cold. Far too cold. Her throat tightened. "What happened to you?" she whispered into the storm. But the woods answered only with wind. Then somewhere far beyond the trees, engines rumbled in the darkness. The sound came again, low and distant this time, buried beneath the storm like thunder trying not to wake the mountains. Evelyn stood frozen for one breath. Then another. Engines. Out here. At nearly 10 o'clock on festival night, nobody came this close to the forest edge unless something had gone terribly wrong. The smaller pup stirred weakly in her arms, its tiny body trembling so hard she could feel every shiver through her coat. Without thinking, she tucked it closer against her chest beside the first pup, wrapping both beneath the thick wool of her sweater. Instantly, the larger one let out the faintest sigh and pressed its nose beneath her chin. Warm breath touched her skin. Trust. The feeling hit harder than she expected. It had been a long time since anyone had trusted her with anything. "Okay," she whispered, brushing melting snow from the smaller pup's face. "Cabin. First. Questions later." Her little cabin sat less than half a mile from the woods, near the eastern creek where pack houses grew sparse and forgotten. Far enough from the center that nobody complained about her presence. Close enough that they still remembered to pity her. Wind clawed through the trees as Evelyn hurried forward, boots sinking deep into snow. Her fingers had gone numb despite holding the pups tightly against her chest, but she barely noticed anymore. Every few seconds she looked down, checking for movement. The smaller pup worried her. Its breathing came shallow and uneven, like it had spent too long fighting cold all alone. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Just a few more minutes." The first pup lifted its head and made a soft sound, almost like agreement. Strange little thing. When she finally pushed open her cabin door, warmth did not exactly greet her. More like stubborn survival. The wood stove still glowed faintly from the fire she had banked before leaving for the Moon Hunt Festival. Her tiny home smelled of cedarwood, cinnamon tea, and old books. Safe, quiet, forgotten. Evelyn kicked the door shut behind her and hurried to the couch. "You are definitely not sleeping outside tonight," she murmured. The larger pup immediately climbed higher into her lap, while she carefully laid the smaller one on a folded blanket. Up close, her heart twisted painfully. Neither looked ordinary. Their fur shimmered strangely beneath the firelight, pale silver threaded with white like moonlight woven into snow. Even dirty and exhausted, they looked expensive somehow. Regal. She almost laughed at herself. Regal wolves? Evelyn, you have officially lost your mind. Still, something about those silver eyes unsettled her. Wolves around the pack had amber eyes. Sometimes blue. Rarely green. Never silver. She swallowed the thought and moved quickly. Warm water. Towels. Goat milk from the icebox. Honey for energy. Her grandmother had always said kindness worked best in practical steps. When she returned with supplies, the larger pup was already curled protectively beside the smaller one. Tiny body pressed close like it refused to let go. Evelyn knelt beside them, soaking a cloth with warm water. "This might feel weird," she whispered softly, "but I promise I am trying to help." The larger pup blinked up at her and, to her surprise, nudged its head into her hand. Her breath caught. Slowly, carefully, she cleaned snow from their fur. Dirt. Leaves. Tiny scratches from branches. Nothing serious, thank God. The smaller one flinched only once before letting out a sleepy little sound and leaning weakly into her touch. Outside, the storm worsened. Somewhere far off, engines rumbled again. Closer this time. Evelyn glanced toward the dark window, unease prickling the back of her neck. Then the larger pup suddenly stiffened. Tiny ears lifted. Silver eyes fixed toward the woods. And for the first time all night, a low sound rose from its chest, not fear. Warning. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. The cabin fell quiet except for the crackling stove and the steady tap of sleet against the windows. Evelyn stayed perfectly still, kneeling beside the couch with a damp towel forgotten in her hands. The larger pup had not moved. Tiny body rigid. Silver eyes fixed toward the front door like it could see through wood and darkness alike. A strange feeling crept through Evelyn's chest. Fear maybe. Or instinct. "Hey," she whispered softly. "What is it?" The pup let out another low sound, softer this time, but no less serious. Not panic. Not pain. Awareness. Beside it, the smaller pup stirred weakly beneath the blanket and pressed closer to its sibling as if sensing the same thing. Evelyn swallowed hard and rose to her feet. Outside, the storm wrapped everything in white shadows. Her cabin sat alone at the edge of the eastern woods, nearly hidden beneath tall pines that groaned under heavy snow. Usually she loved the isolation. Tonight it felt too quiet, too empty. She moved carefully toward the window near the kitchen sink and wiped fog from the glass with her sleeve. Darkness stared back. Nothing but swirling snow and crooked trees. Still, unease lingered beneath her ribs. The engines had definitely sounded closer. Maybe hunters heading back from the festival. Maybe patrol. Maybe nothing at all. Evelyn exhaled slowly. "You are tired, cold, and imagining things." She turned back toward the pups. The larger one immediately relaxed a little when it saw her moving closer again. That alone made something ache softly inside her. Trust came easy to babies. Animals too. They did not care about reputation or status or whispered insults at bonfires. They only cared whether someone stayed. Evelyn knew something about being left behind. She crossed back to the couch and crouched beside them again. "Okay," she whispered, forcing warmth into her voice. "First rule of surviving winter storms? We eat." The larger pup tilted its head, watching her carefully as she poured warm goat milk into a shallow bowl. The smaller one barely lifted its head. Evelyn's worry deepened. "Come on, little guy," she murmured gently. "You have to help me out here." She dipped 2 fingers into the milk and offered them carefully. For a second nothing happened. Then the smaller pup sniffed weakly before giving the tiniest lick. Relief washed through her so fast she nearly laughed. "That is it," she whispered. "Good job." The larger pup, apparently deciding she had passed some invisible test, climbed directly into her lap without warning. Evelyn blinked down in surprise as warm paws settled against her sweater. Tiny nose nudged insistently beneath her hand. She laughed softly before she could stop herself. "You are bossy." The pup made a pleased sound and curled tightly against her stomach, as if the decision had already been made. Home. Something fragile and painful moved through Evelyn's chest. Nobody had needed her in a very long time. Not since her grandmother passed last winter. The silence afterward had settled over the cabin like dust, heavy and stubborn. Nights stretched too long. Meals felt pointless alone. But now warmth shifted against her lap. Tiny breaths rose and fell. Life. The smaller pup finally drank a little more before collapsing back into the blanket, exhausted. The larger one never stopped touching her, pressing closer every chance it got. Outside, wind rattled the roof. Then suddenly headlights flashed through the trees. Bright. White. Moving fast. Evelyn stiffened. The larger pup lifted its head. Instantly and let out a sharp sound unlike anything she had heard all night. Not warning this time. Recognition. The headlights disappeared for one terrifying second behind the trees, then returned brighter than before, cutting through the snowfall like pale knives across the dark woods. Evelyn's pulse stumbled. Nobody came out here this late. Not during a storm. Not unless something serious had happened. The larger pup slid off her lap before she could stop it. Tiny paws hit the floor with surprising confidence. It moved toward the door, ears raised, tail stiff. The strange little sound came again from its throat. Sharp. Urgent. Familiar somehow. Not fear. Expectation. "Wait," Evelyn whispered, crouching quickly. "You are not going outside." She reached for it, but the pup twisted gently away, silver eyes locked on the front entrance. Behind her, the smaller pup stirred weakly beneath the blanket and let out a sleepy cry. Instantly the larger one turned back. 1 heartbeat. 2. Then it padded straight to the couch again and climbed halfway onto Evelyn's leg as if refusing to choose between them. The gesture hit her harder than it should have. "Okay," she murmured softly. "Nobody is leaving anybody." Outside, tires crunched over snow. Closer now. Much closer. The storm swallowed most sounds, but she could still hear the low hum of engines settling into silence somewhere near the tree line. Her cabin suddenly felt impossibly small. 1 room. Thin walls. A single lock on the front door that barely worked if the wood swelled in winter. Evelyn stood slowly, wiping her damp hands against her jeans. Maybe somebody got lost. Maybe festival patrol. Maybe someone needed help. Yet unease curled tighter beneath her ribs. Because the larger pup was watching the door the way frightened people watch storms coming over mountains. Like something unavoidable had finally arrived. Then came the knock. 3 slow taps against the wood. Firm. Heavy. Not impatient. Not angry. Just certain. Evelyn froze. Her breath clouded faintly in front of her face despite the stove burning warm nearby. Nobody knocked like that around here. People barged in. Shouted from porches. Laughed too. Loud. This felt different. Controlled. Deliberate. The larger pup immediately pressed against her calf. Tiny body tense. Not hiding. Staying close. "Just a second," Evelyn called softly, surprising herself. Why had she said that? Her instincts screamed caution. Still, she moved carefully toward the door, glancing once toward the couch where the smaller pup slept curled into the blanket. Safe. For now. Another knock came. Quiet. Patient. Snow rattled softly against the roof. Evelyn reached the door and hesitated, fingers hovering near the lock. Something in the air felt strange. Heavy somehow. Like the moment before thunder rolled over the hills. Slowly, she cracked the door open 2 inches. Freezing air rushed inside carrying snow and pine and something colder still. Outside stood 3 figures dressed in black winter coats dusted with white. Tall, broad-shouldered, silent. The 2 men nearest the porch looked serious enough to make her instantly nervous. Their posture alone radiated authority. But it was the man standing behind them that stole the breath from her lungs. He stood perfectly still beneath the falling snow, nearly 6.5 feet tall, dark coat brushing heavy boots. Black hair moved lightly in the wind. Hands bare despite the cold. Calm, silent, terrifyingly composed. Snow settled across his shoulders and somehow made him look even sharper, colder. But it was his eyes that stopped her completely. Silver. Bright silver. Exactly like the pups. The larger pup suddenly pushed against the door harder, and let out the smallest sound all night. Not warning. Not fear. Relief. For one strange second nobody moved. Snow drifted quietly between them, melting against the porch light while cold winds slipped through the narrow opening of the door. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the handle. The tall stranger did not speak immediately. He simply stood there watching her with unsettling stillness, silver eyes flicking once toward the floor near her legs. Toward the pup. Something changed in his expression then. Not softer exactly, but sharper somehow. Focused. Behind him, one of the men shifted slightly. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, voice respectful, almost cautious. "The scent confirms it. Your Majesty." The words landed awkwardly inside Evelyn's mind, refusing to settle into anything reasonable. Majesty? Here. At her tiny cabin near the eastern creek where nobody important ever came? The larger pup made a sound she had not heard before, suddenly wriggling against the door. Tiny paws scratched lightly at the wood as though trying desperately to reach the man standing outside. But strangely, it did not leave her side. Instead, it leaned harder against her ankle while staring up at him. Torn. The tall man lowered his gaze slowly. For the first time since she opened the door, something unmistakably human crossed his face. Relief. Deep enough to hurt. Gone almost immediately. "You found them," he said at last. His voice startled her. Low. Calm. Smooth in a way that felt dangerous without trying to be. Like someone used to being obeyed without raising his tone. Evelyn blinked. "Found who?" she asked quietly, though deep down she already knew the answer. Silver eyes. Silver eyes everywhere. The larger pup gave another small cry and looked between them as though impatient with how slowly humans understood things. The stranger crouched slightly, movements careful, controlled. "Orion," he said softly. The pup froze. Tiny ears lifted instantly. Then came another word. "Aspen." Behind Evelyn, the smaller pup stirred on the couch. A sleepy little sound drifted through the cabin. Everything changed. The stillness outside sharpened. One of the men behind the stranger actually exhaled like he had been holding his breath for hours. The tall man closed his eyes briefly, shoulders loosening just enough for exhaustion to slip through the cracks. When he looked at Evelyn again, something unreadable lingered beneath the cold silver of his gaze. Gratitude, maybe, or disbelief. "My sons," he said quietly. The words settled over the porch heavier than snow. Evelyn forgot how to breathe for a second. "Sons." Her eyes dropped instantly toward the tiny pup pressed against her leg. Impossible. Completely impossible. Yet suddenly every strange detail made sense. The unusual fur. The silver eyes. The way they carried themselves despite being so small. Regal. Her ridiculous thought from earlier suddenly did not feel ridiculous anymore. "They were alone in the woods," she said quickly, stepping back without meaning to. "The smaller one was freezing. I brought them inside because I did not know what else to do." The stranger's gaze shifted briefly over her shoulder toward the warm light inside. Toward safety. Toward where one child slept while the other refused to move away from her. Something flickered across his face again. Surprise this time. Real surprise. "They stayed with you," he said quietly, almost to himself. One of the guards behind him exchanged a quick glance with the other. Uneasy. Curious. The larger pup suddenly climbed halfway up Evelyn's leg, tiny claws catching her sweater as if making a point. "Not leaving. Not yet." The stranger watched the gesture in complete silence. Then finally, very softly, he said, "I am Lucian Ashthorne." Snow swirled harder between them. And I believe, he continued, eyes dropping once more to the pup refusing to leave her side. My children have made a very unexpected decision. The cabin suddenly felt too small for the moment unfolding inside it. Wind rattled softly against the windows while warm firelight flickered across rough wooden walls, touching everything with quiet gold. Yet somehow all Evelyn could feel was the impossible weight of silver eyes watching her. Lucian Ashthorne. Even she knew that name. Everyone did. The Alpha King of the Northern Territories. Stories followed him like shadows. Ruthless in negotiations. Untouchable in power. Quiet in ways that unsettled people more than shouting ever could. Men lowered their voices when they spoke about him. Women whispered legends after dark. And somehow, impossibly, he stood on her porch while snow gathered on his shoulders like frost dared not melt against him. Evelyn swallowed hard. Your sons, she repeated softly, looking down at the tiny pup stubbornly attached to her sweater. Orion. The name somehow fit. Strong for something so small. I did not know, she admitted quickly. I just found them freezing in the woods. Lucian's gaze softened by the smallest fraction as it shifted toward the couch where Aspen slept curled into blankets near the stove. Relief flickered there again, sharper this time. More personal. Not a king now. A father. You brought them into warmth, he said quietly. Most would not have. Something uncomfortable twisted inside Evelyn at that. Most would not have. Of course they would not. Around here, kindness often came with conditions. Strays got ignored. Weak things got overlooked. Especially if helping them caused trouble. Evelyn glanced away. They were scared, she said simply, because anything more felt too big to explain. And cold. Orion chose that exact moment to climb higher against her chest, tiny paws catching her sweater while he pushed his nose beneath her chin like he had known her forever. Evelyn let out a surprised breath. Oh, okay. Behind Lucian, one of the guards looked genuinely alarmed. Your Majesty, he said carefully. Prince Orion does not usually. He stopped. Lucian had already noticed. Evelyn could tell by the way complete stillness settled over him. Not coldness this time. Attention. Focused and unreadable. Orion had apparently made a very unusual choice. He trusts you, Lucian said after a moment. Quietly. Like the realization mattered more than he expected. Evelyn blinked. He barely knows me. Yet even as she said it, Orion tucked himself impossibly closer. Warm little body pressed against her heartbeat. As if disagreement had been rejected entirely. Then came a tiny sleepy sound from the couch. Aspen stirred. The moment Lucian stepped 1 foot inside the cabin, the smaller pup lifted his head weakly. Silver eyes blinked once. Twice. Recognition bloomed instantly. A tiny cry escaped him. Lucian crossed the room in 3 calm steps and crouched beside the couch with surprising care. For the first time all night, the terrifying aura surrounding him softened completely. His hand brushed lightly across Aspen's fur. Easy little wolf, he murmured. His voice changed when speaking to his child. Lower somehow. Gentler. Aspen nudged weakly against his hand before suddenly glancing past him. Toward Evelyn. Tiny body trembling again. Without warning, the pup struggled upright and stumbled directly off. The blanket toward her. Aspen, Lucian said quietly, reaching instinctively. But Aspen ignored him completely. The tiny pup crossed the floor on shaky legs and pressed straight against Evelyn's boots with a desperate little sound. Then, as if nothing in the world made more sense, he climbed clumsily into her lap beside Orion and collapsed against her chest. Lucian went perfectly still. So did the guards. Silence settled over the cabin like snowfall. Then one guard muttered very softly, almost to himself, "That has never happened before." Silence stretched so long that Evelyn became painfully aware of everything at once. The warmth from the stove brushing her skin. Snow tapping softly against the windows. The steady rise and fall of 2 tiny bodies pressed against her chest as if they had always belonged there. Orion curled higher beneath her chin, impossibly content now that Aspen had joined him. The smaller pup let out one sleepy sigh and tucked his nose against her sweater, tiny body finally relaxing for the first time all night. Safe. That was the word hanging unspoken in the room. Safe. Lucian Ashthorne still had not moved. He stood only a few feet away, broad shoulders impossibly still beneath the dark coat dusted with melting snow. But something had shifted in his expression. Not confusion exactly. Confusion belonged to ordinary people. This looked rare. Disbelief. The kind earned only after witnessing something impossible with your own eyes. One of the guards finally cleared his throat quietly. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "Prince Aspen has not accepted touch from anyone outside the royal physician since—" His voice trailed off awkwardly. Lucian did not look away from Evelyn. "I know," he said quietly. The words carried weight. Memory. Concern carefully hidden beneath control. Evelyn glanced between them uncertainly. "Are they okay?" she asked softly. "I mean, besides being cold." The question felt ridiculous the second it left her mouth. Of course they were not okay. Royal wolf pups apparently did not wander into snowstorms alone. Yet Lucian answered without impatience. "They disappeared 6 hours ago during travel," he said, voice calm but quieter now. "Their convoy was delayed during the storm. We believe they slipped away frightened." 6 hours. Evelyn looked down immediately. Orion's fur still felt damp in places despite the towels. Aspen remained cold against her chest, though warmer now than before. Her stomach twisted painfully. 6 hours outside in this weather could have gone very differently. "They must have been terrified," she murmured without thinking. Lucian's gaze flickered to her face then. Something unreadable crossed his silver eyes. Because she had said terrified, not troublesome, not reckless. Terrified. Like their fear mattered. Orion shifted slightly at the sound of her voice and pushed closer beneath her chin. Aspen made another sleepy sound and copied him, curling tighter into her sweater like warmth alone could erase the storm. Behind Lucian, the guards exchanged another look. This time even Evelyn noticed. One of them looked genuinely unsettled. The other looked almost impressed. "Strange." "Miss Carter," Lucian said after a moment, voice softer than before. "I owe you a debt." Evelyn blinked so fast she nearly laughed from nerves. "You really do not. You sheltered my children," he said simply. "Fed them. Kept them warm." The certainty in his voice left no room for dismissal. "That debt exists whether you wish to acknowledge it or not." Nobody spoke to Evelyn like that. Not with respect. Not like what she had done mattered. Usually kindness earned pity at best. Mockery at worst. "You are too soft," people like to say. Too weak. Too emotional. Yet here stood the alpha king of the Northern Territories looking at her as though softness had somehow saved something priceless. Before she could respond, headlights suddenly swept across the front window again. More vehicles. Then came voices outside. Familiar voices. Loud enough to make her stomach immediately sink. "Evelyn!" Someone shouted from the snow. "Open up." Her blood ran cold. Beta Matthew. Of course. Moon Hunt Festival had ended, which meant the pack had started noticing who was missing. Orion lifted his head instantly. Aspen stirred. Lucian's expression changed in a heartbeat. Not anger. Not fear. Something colder. Watchful. Then came another voice outside, louder this time. "We tracked rogue wolves here," Matthew called. "Step away from the door, Evelyn." The warmth vanished from the room almost instantly. Not because the fire had gone out, but because fear moved faster than cold. Evelyn's stomach tightened hard enough to hurt. Matthew. Of all nights, of all moments, it had to be him. She knew exactly what this looked like from the outside. Strange wolves near Packland. Her cabin lights still on. Evelyn Carter, the Omega everyone quietly underestimated, somehow involved in trouble again. Outside, snow crunched beneath boots. More than one person. At least 3. Maybe 4. "Evelyn." Matthew called again, louder this time. "Do not make this difficult." Orion immediately pressed closer into her sweater. Tiny body stiff against her ribs. Aspen let out a soft distressed sound and buried himself deeper against her chest as though trying to disappear completely. The reaction happened so quickly Evelyn barely had time to think. Fear. They were afraid. Her arms tightened instinctively around both pups. "They are scared," she whispered before she even realized she had spoken out loud. Silence answered her for one long heartbeat. Then Lucian moved. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just once. One step forward. Yet somehow the entire room changed around him. Stillness deepened, the kind that made storms feel smaller. His expression remained unreadable, silver eyes drifting briefly toward the trembling pups pressed against Evelyn. Something dark flickered there. Not anger exactly. Something colder. Protective. One of the guards shifted subtly toward the door. "Your Majesty," he said quietly. Lucian raised one hand slightly. The guard immediately stopped speaking. Outside, another knock rattled the cabin harder this time. "We know you are in there," Matthew called. "Several villagers saw movement around your place. If there are rogues, step away immediately." Rogues. The word made Orion let out the faintest sound against Evelyn's chest. Small. Offended almost. Aspen tucked closer beneath her chin. Evelyn looked down helplessly. "They are babies," she whispered softly. "They are." Terrified. Lucian's gaze lingered on her face for one strange second, like he was trying to understand something he had forgotten existed. Compassion without calculation. Then came another voice outside. Female this time. "Matthew," someone called uncertainly. "What if she is hurt?" Evelyn recognized that voice too. Hannah. One of the few pack members who occasionally smiled at her during market days. Kind but cautious. Matthew answered before Evelyn could think. "The rogues could already be inside," he snapped. "Open the door now, Evelyn." The larger guard exhaled slowly. "This is becoming inconvenient," he muttered under his breath. Lucian ignored him completely. Instead, his attention returned to Evelyn. "Do they trust this man outside?" he asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. Not "is he dangerous?" Not "should my guards remove him?" Trust. As though the pups mattered more than pride. Evelyn looked down instinctively. Orion had gone perfectly still. Aspen trembled harder. Neither moved toward the door. Neither relaxed. Her answer came before words did. "No," she admitted quietly. Lucian nodded once. Tiny. Final somehow. Then before she could process what was happening, he stepped toward the door. Snowlight caught the sharp line of his jaw. Calm settled over him like armor. "Remain here," he said softly, voice low enough that somehow she obeyed before thinking. Orion immediately curled tighter against her. Aspen followed. The guard straightened instinctively. Outside, Matthew knocked again. "Last chance, Evelyn." Lucian's hand closed around the door handle. Then he opened it. Cold wind rushed inside. Snow swirled across the floor. And Matthew's voice died instantly. Matthew Thornridge stopped speaking so abruptly that silence crashed over the porch harder than the storm. Snow swirled between them in pale sheets, settling across parked trucks and heavy boots while cold winds swept through the trees. For one long second, nobody moved. Matthew stood frozen halfway up the porch steps, mouth slightly open, confidence draining from his face so quickly it almost looked painful. Behind him, Hannah inhaled sharply. Someone near the truck muttered something under their breath that sounded suspiciously like, "No way." Because standing in the doorway of Evelyn Carter's tiny forgotten cabin was not some frightened Omega needing rescue. It was King Lucian Ashthorne. The Alpha King stood perfectly still, one hand resting lightly against the open door as snow gathered silently across his dark coat. He did not look angry. Somehow that made everything worse. Calm radiated from him with terrifying certainty, the kind that made excuses die before reaching anyone's lips. Silver eyes settled on Matthew without hurry. "You were saying?" Lucian asked quietly. Matthew swallowed so hard Evelyn could hear it from inside. Gone was the smug confidence from festival nights. Gone were careless insults and easy laughter. He looked suddenly younger. Smaller somehow. "Your Majesty," Matthew said quickly, stumbling over the words. "I did not know. We were informed there were rogue wolves near Packland." Lucian's expression did not change. "And your first instinct," he said evenly, "was to approach a lone Omega's home during a storm?" The question landed softly, which somehow made it worse. Matthew opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "We believed she might be in danger." Behind him, Hannah shifted awkwardly, guilt flashing briefly across her face. Because everyone standing there knew the truth. Nobody checked on Evelyn Carter because they cared. They checked because trouble had found her, and trouble was always more interesting than kindness. Inside the cabin, Evelyn tightened her arms around the pups instinctively. Orion had lifted his head again, ears alert. Aspen stayed tucked tightly against her chest, tiny body trembling whenever voices outside grew louder. Lucian noticed immediately. His silver gaze flicked once toward the pups, toward the fear still trembling through small bodies that had finally begun to feel safe. Something colder entered the room. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. The wolves inside this cabin, Lucian said calmly, are under my protection. Matthew blinked once, then twice. Confusion hit first, then realization. His face drained of color. Hannah actually stepped back a little. Your protection, Matthew repeated weakly. Lucian stepped aside just enough for the porch light to reach deeper into the cabin, just enough for Silver eyes to be seen clearly. Two tiny wolf pups curled tightly against Evelyn's sweater, refusing to move farther than inches away from her heartbeat. Orion immediately tucked himself closer beneath her chin. Aspen made a sleepy sound and pressed tighter against her chest. Complete trust. Nobody outside spoke. Nobody even breathed loudly, because suddenly the impossible stood right in front of them. Royal blood. The missing heirs. Safe inside the cabin of the Omega they mocked hours ago. Matthew looked genuinely horrified now. We did not know, he said quickly. Nobody said the princes were missing. Lucian regarded him quietly. Snow melted slowly across dark shoulders. Yet you came prepared to remove frightened children from the woman sheltering them, he said. Again no anger. No raised voice. Somehow worse. Behind Matthew, Hannah's gaze finally shifted toward Evelyn. Really looked at her for the first time. The pups curled safely in her arms. The exhaustion on her face. The firelight touching tired hands still smelling faintly of milk and cedar soap. Something like shame crossed Hannah's expression. Then Orion suddenly lifted his tiny head and let out a small unhappy sound toward the open door. Cold air. Too much noise. Instantly, both pups burrowed closer against Evelyn's chest like frightened little shadows seeking warmth. Lucian looked back once. Saw it. And everything in his expression changed. The change happened so quietly that nobody noticed it at first. Lucian looked at his sons for only a second, but something in him shifted completely. The cold distance in his silver eyes disappeared beneath something older, sharper, protective in a way that felt almost dangerous without becoming cruel. Orion pressed tighter beneath Evelyn's chin, tiny body trembling from the draft slipping through the open doorway. Aspen buried his nose against her sweater with a sleepy little sound that felt heartbreakingly small after everything they had survived. Cold air touched them and instinctively they moved closer to her. Not their father. Her. Lucian noticed. Of course he noticed. Nothing about him suggested he missed details. He turned back toward Matthew slowly. Calm remained in his expression, but the room somehow felt heavier. Like everyone suddenly understood that this conversation had stopped being casual several minutes ago. The princes are exhausted, Lucian said evenly. And frightened. Matthew nodded too quickly. Of course, Your Majesty. We only wanted to help. The lie landed awkwardly in the snow between them. Evelyn felt it immediately. So did Hannah, judging by the way guilt flickered across her face again. Because everybody knew how tonight had started. Matthew mocking her near the festival fire. People laughing when she was pushed away from warmth. Nobody looking for Evelyn Carter because they cared whether she was cold. Yet here they stood now, pretending concern because royalty had entered the story. Lucian remained silent long enough to make Matthew visibly uncomfortable. Then finally he spoke again. Help, he repeated quietly. Interesting word. Snow drifted across the porch. Nobody interrupted him. Miss Carter found two frightened children alone during a winter storm, Lucian continued. She sheltered them, fed them, kept them warm. His silver gaze shifted briefly toward Evelyn, toward the pups sleeping against her chest. Meanwhile, others arrived prepared to call them rogues. Matthew lowered his eyes instantly. Hannah looked like she wanted to disappear into the snow. Inside the cabin, Evelyn felt heat creep embarrassingly across her face. Nobody had defended her before. Not publicly. Not like this. Usually people explained away cruelty. Matthew is just teasing. You are too sensitive. Try harder to fit in. Yet Lucian spoke about what she had done as though kindness mattered, as though it carried weight. Orion stretched sleepily against her sweater. Aspen let out a tiny sigh and tucked one paw over her wrist without waking. The gesture happened so naturally that Evelyn barely noticed until Lucian's gaze landed on it. His expression stilled again. Not cold this time. Thoughtful. Careful. Like he was seeing something he did not fully understand. One of the guards finally stepped closer, lowering his voice respectfully. "Your Majesty," he murmured. "The medical team is waiting at the estate. The princes should return soon." Return. The word settled heavily inside the cabin. Evelyn's chest tightened unexpectedly. Of course they would leave. They belong somewhere grand and safe and important. Royal estates. Warm halls. People trained to care for them. Not her tiny cabin with uneven floors and one stubborn wood stove. Still, her arms tightened unconsciously around the pups. Just a little. Orion made an immediately pleased sound and pushed closer. Aspen followed without hesitation. Lucian noticed that too. He crouched slowly this time, movements deliberate, careful enough not to frighten anyone. Even Matthew looked confused by the shift in him. The Alpha King lowered himself just enough to be closer to eye level with his sons. "Orion," he said softly. "Aspen." Two tiny ears twitched. Aspen blinked awake first. Orion lifted his head reluctantly. Lucian extended one hand slowly. Calm. Patient. A father asking, not demanding. For one hopeful second, Evelyn thought they might go to him. Instead, both pups pressed deeper against her chest at exactly the same moment. Orion buried himself beneath her chin. Aspen climbed halfway into her sweater like he intended to disappear there forever. Complete refusal. Behind Lucian, one guard inhaled sharply. Matthew stared openly now. Hannah whispered something under her breath that sounded suspiciously like, "Oh my God." Lucian remained perfectly still. Then, after one long quiet moment, he asked softly, almost to himself, "Why are they choosing you?" The question settled softly into the room, but somehow it felt heavier than anything spoken all night. "Why are they choosing you?" Evelyn opened her mouth, then closed it again. She did not know. That was the frightening part. She looked down instinctively at the tiny silver bodies curled against her chest like they had nowhere safer left in the world. Orion had somehow wedged himself impossibly close beneath her chin, tiny paws resting stubbornly against her collarbone. Aspen remained pressed against her heartbeat, one paw still draped over her wrist as though afraid she might disappear if he let go. They trusted her. Completely. The realization felt too big to fit inside her chest. "I do not know," she admitted quietly. "I just stayed." Her voice sounded smaller than she intended. Honest. They were cold. And scared. Silence followed. But this time it felt different. Not tense. Listening. Lucian remained crouched in front of her, silver eyes flicking briefly toward Orion, then Aspen. His expression shifted again, something thoughtful threading beneath the calm. "Stayed," he repeated quietly, almost like the word mattered more than expected. Behind him, one of the guards cleared his throat awkwardly. "Your Majesty," he said carefully. "The princes have never responded like this before." The other guard nodded once. "Especially after difficult travel," he added. "Usually they do not settle for hours." Evelyn blinked. "They do not?" she asked softly before she could stop herself. Lucian shook his head once. "Orion rarely trusts strangers," he said. "Aspen trusts almost no one when frightened." His gaze shifted back to where Aspen slept against her sweater without hesitation. Something unreadable crossed his face. Not suspicion. Not jealousy. Wonder maybe. The kind people tried not to show because it made them vulnerable. Outside, snow continued falling thick and quiet. Matthew still stood near the porch steps, awkwardly forgotten for the moment, while Hannah remained beside him looking increasingly uncomfortable. She had not stopped glancing toward Evelyn since seeing the pups curled safely against her. Finally, quietly, Hannah spoke. "You stayed out in the storm for them?" she asked softly. Evelyn hesitated, then shrugged one shoulder. They needed help. Simple. Obvious. At least to her. Matthew looked genuinely confused by that answer. Like kindness without reward did not make sense. Lucian noticed that too. His gaze cooled fractionally toward the porch again before returning to Evelyn. And yet, he said quietly, nobody stayed for you. The words hit harder than they should have. Evelyn looked down instantly, because he was not wrong. Not tonight. Not most nights. She remembered. Standing near the festival fire while people laughed. Remembered walking home alone through knee-deep snow while warmth stayed behind with everyone else. Nobody checked if she got home safely. Nobody noticed she was gone until wolves became part of the story. Orion shifted sleepily against her neck, making a tiny sound as though disagreeing with sadness itself. Aspen pressed closer too. Warm. Safe. Here. Something unexpectedly protective softened Lucian's expression again. He rose slowly to his feet this time, attention lingering on the exhausted little bodies refusing to leave her side. The medical team should examine them, one guard reminded gently. Lucian nodded once. Yes. Then came the problem nobody wanted to say out loud. How exactly were they supposed to move two royal wolf pups, who clearly had no intention of leaving? The answer arrived before anyone spoke. Lucian reached one careful hand forward again, patient and calm. Orion, he said softly. Come. Orion blinked, sleepy silver eyes open. Looked at his father. Considered it seriously for exactly 1 second. Then turned around, buried himself deeper against Evelyn's neck, and sighed dramatically like the discussion had already ended. Aspen copied him immediately. Behind Lucian, Hannah covered her mouth. Matthew looked completely horrified. One guard muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, "That is definitely new." Lucian stared for one long second before quietly exhaling through his nose. Then very calmly he said the one thing nobody expected. "Miss Carter," he asked softly, "would you consider coming with us?" For one impossible second, Evelyn thought she had misheard him. The words landed softly, calmly, as though the Alpha King inviting someone into his world happened every day. Would you consider coming with us? Outside, snow continued falling in quiet silver sheets. Inside, the cabin felt strangely still, like the entire room had stopped breathing just to hear her answer. Matthew looked as though someone had physically removed the ground beneath him. Hannah blinked several times, mouth opening slightly before closing again. Even the guards exchanged a brief glance, because everyone understood what had just happened. The Alpha King was not asking for help. He was asking for Evelyn Carter, the forgotten Omega, the girl people left standing in the cold beside festival fires. Evelyn's pulse stumbled painfully in her chest. Her voice disappeared. She looked down instinctively at the tiny silver bodies curled impossibly close against her sweater. Orion had somehow managed to tuck himself halfway beneath her chin again, eyes barely open with sleep. Aspen looked smaller now that warmth had softened the tension from his little body. His breathing came steadier, calmer. Every few seconds, one tiny paw twitched against her sweater like he needed to remind himself she was still there. The thought of moving suddenly felt impossible. The thought of staying somehow felt worse. "I do not think they want me to leave," she admitted quietly. A tiny huff came from Orion as though he had been consulted and agreed entirely. One of Lucian's guards actually smiled before quickly hiding it. Lucian, however, did not smile. He simply watched the pups for one long thoughtful moment. "No," he said quietly. "I do not believe they do." His voice held something new now. Respect. Careful and unmistakable. Like her answer mattered. Nobody had spoken to Evelyn that way in years. Maybe ever. Matthew finally found his voice. "Your Majesty," he said too quickly, clearly trying to recover himself. "Surely there are people better suited to care for them." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Everyone froze. Hannah looked horrified instantly. Evelyn felt something cold twist painfully in her stomach. Better suited. There it was again. The familiar language of people quietly reminding her she never quite fit anywhere important. But Lucian's expression changed immediately. Calm remained, but something sharp settled beneath it. "Final. Better suited," he repeated softly. Matthew swallowed. Hard. Lucian turned slightly, silver eyes flicking toward the pups tucked safely against Evelyn like frightened little stars finally finding warmth. "My sons have made their preference exceptionally clear," he said evenly. "I trust their instincts." Silence crashed across the room. Matthew looked like he wanted to disappear into the snow. Hannah lowered her eyes completely, because everybody heard what had really been said. The Alpha King trusted the frightened children more than the judgment of people who mocked kindness. Evelyn looked down quickly, heat rising embarrassingly into her face. Orion shifted again and let out the tiniest sleepy sound before pressing closer. Aspen followed immediately. Her chest ached unexpectedly. Nobody had chosen her before. Not for friendship. Not for trust. Certainly not for something important. Yet somehow 2 tiny hearts had curled into her arms and decided she felt safe. Lucian stepped closer then, slow enough not to frighten the pups. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "this is not a command." The words surprised her. He could command entire territories. Yet here he stood, speaking gently in a tiny cabin that smelled faintly of cinnamon tea and cedarwood. "But I would be grateful," he continued softly, "if you stayed near them until they feel secure again." Something in his voice changed at the last sentence. Small. Human. A father asking, not a king ordering. Evelyn looked at the exhausted little faces pressed against her sweater. Then at the snow still falling outside. Then back at Lucian Ashthorne standing impossibly still in her doorway. Before she could answer, Aspen suddenly stirred in his sleep and made one tiny sleepy sound that stopped everyone cold. "Mama!" Aspen's tiny sleepy voice slipped into the room so softly that for one impossible second, nobody seemed to understand what had happened. Then silence hit all at once. Heavy. Complete. Snow continued falling outside, tapping gently against the windows like the world had forgotten to breathe. Evelyn froze. Completely. Her heart stumbled painfully inside her chest as she looked down at the tiny silver pup curled against her sweater, still half asleep, tiny paw resting trustingly over her hand. Aspen barely stirred after speaking. He only sighed softly and tucked himself closer like warmth itself had answered him. Beside him, Orion shifted once and pressed deeper beneath her chin, entirely unconcerned by the emotional disaster he had just helped create. Matthew's face lost what little color remained. Hannah's mouth opened slightly before she looked away, visibly overwhelmed by something she could not explain. Even the guards had gone still. One quietly cleared his throat before immediately deciding silence was smarter. Because nobody standing inside that tiny cedar-smelling cabin knew what exactly to do with what they had just heard. Nobody except Lucian. The Alpha King remained perfectly motionless. But something changed behind his silver eyes. Shock came first. Real shock. Gone too quickly for anyone else to notice. Then came something quieter. Older. A kind of grief softened by hope so fragile it almost hurt to witness. He looked at Aspen. Then Orion. Then finally at Evelyn standing there holding both frightened little hearts like she had done it her whole life. Safe. The word lingered again. Safe enough to sleep. Safe enough to trust. Safe enough for frightened children to accidentally say things they meant without understanding why. Evelyn swallowed hard. "I think he was dreaming," she said quickly, because the room suddenly felt too small for anything else. Her voice sounded embarrassingly nervous. "He is exhausted." Lucian's gaze lingered on her face 1 second too long. Not uncomfortable. Thoughtful. Like he was carefully rearranging something inside his understanding of the world. Finally, very quietly, he spoke. "Perhaps," he said softly, yet he did not sound convinced. Orion stretched lazily then, blinking silver eyes open just long enough to glance between Lucian and Evelyn. He considered the situation with all the seriousness of a tiny prince. Then, without warning, he climbed higher against Evelyn's shoulder and made himself comfortable like the matter had already been decided. A soft laugh escaped one guard before he immediately pretended it had not happened. Lucian exhaled quietly through his nose. Not quite amusement. Close enough to surprise everyone. "Well," he said at last, voice lower now, calmer somehow, "I believe my sons have issued their own royal decree." That finally pulled the tiniest startled laugh from Evelyn despite herself. Small. Uncertain. But real. Matthew looked horrified by the sound. Hannah looked strangely relieved. Because for the first time all night, Evelyn Carter no longer looked like someone standing outside the warmth of the world. Lucian stepped forward once more, careful and unhurried. "Gather what you need," he said quietly. Warm clothes. Essentials. Evelyn blinked. You mean tonight? Snow swirled softly outside. The storm had not stopped. Yet somehow everything had already changed. Lucian glanced briefly toward the pup sleeping against her chest before meeting her gaze again. Tonight, he said simply. Because I have a feeling, and here, for the first time all evening, something unmistakably gentle touched his voice, that if we leave without you, Orion immediately tightened tiny paws against her sweater. Aspen made another sleepy sound and tucked closer. Lucian's expression softened by the smallest fraction. I may never convince them to come home.